Right, hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this very special American Enterprise Institute and Henry Jackson Society meeting on lessons from an unserious superpower, the Scoop Jackson legacy, and US foreign policy. You're probably wondering, if you're a seasoned AI viewer, who I am. Well, I am Alan Mendoza. I'm the director and one of the founders of the Henry Jackson Society, which, despite the name being after the subject of today's discussion, and of course a noted US senator, we are actually a UK-based foreign and security policy think tank. And the question is always asked, why, if you are in the UK, would you have taken on the name of Senator Scoop Jackson? And the answer is very simply, as you will discover this afternoon, because of the unique, I think, approach that Jackson took to foreign policy, number one. Number two, I think in terms of the ideas that he had, and I think what was interesting to us when we were conceptualizing 20 years ago, what would we call an organization in the UK that should be based on values but also strategic interests? Well, you take a look at Scoop Jackson and you see why and how that can happen. And I think before we kind of go into the whole entree, and you're going to hear the thesis as to why we might find Senator Jackson's viewpoints interesting today. When we started 20 years ago, we found it interesting because we noted from history that Senator Jackson occupied a pivotal role in Cold War thinking, taking a look firstly at the strategic side of the debate, looking at, if you like, the threat from the Soviets in a conventional military sense, and of course, suggesting that we needed both to build up our defenses and also, crucially, to build up alliances to do so. But secondly, that there was a moral point of view to his thinking as well. And what I think Senator Jackson surveyed was that the Soviet Union was essentially the purveyor of, to use a later phrase, the evil empire. It was a challenge to our values as much as to our control physically, and that the communist system, which wanted to expunge freedom, destroy liberty, had no value for human rights, wished to replace capitalism with its own flawed economic system, was truly trying to, if you like, subvert what we were doing in the free world. So bringing those two things together were very important to us, the moral and, of course, the strategic. This sort of landscape had changed in the early 2000s, but as we see now, it has not changed in the concept of who the unfree world is versus the free world. And we think those are enduring values. And I have to say, we also liked, frankly, the stress on bipartisanship that Senator Jackson always took. He had a saying that, in the politics of national security, there are no politics. And essentially, that is what we feel as well, that it doesn't matter what side of the political debate you are, there are certain immutable matters when it comes to national security, foreign policy and defence, which should enable us to reach across that divide and come together in the national interest firstly, and secondly, of course, in our broader alliance interest. So that's what we do. You can check out our work at www.henryjacksonsociety.org, and we'll discuss a bit more how the UK angle might play into our whole discussion today. But we are, of course, here to talk about this paper, and we're going to start with the author of the paper, Nicholas Eberstadt. Now, Nick has written really a very interesting, as he would say, a retrospective about why we should pick up lessons of the past and for the future. But he, of course, will be known to many of you. He's the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at AEI. He researches and writes extensively on demographics and economic development generally, and indeed on international security in the Indo-Pacific, but beyond as well. And he's also a senior advisor to the National Bureau of Asian Research and has a whole litany of books and testimony to ascribe his worth. And then after Nick has presented his paper, we will bring in Elliott Abrams. Elliott, again, will be no stranger to many of you. He's a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, obviously in DC, and he served, of course, as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor, most recently in the George W. Bush administration, and indeed he was the representative for Iran and special representative for Iran and Venezuela in the Donald Trump administration. So clearly has much to do, but for the purposes of today's discussion, he of course also famously worked with Scoop Jackson. So I'm sure we're going to hear a bit more about that. But I'm going to turn it over to Nick to kick us off. Nick, present your thesis. Why is the Scoop Jacksonian legacy important to us today?
Alan, thank you very much for introducing this session. Elliott, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really listening forward to what both of you will have to say. in your substantive remarks and in perhaps also reminiscences about Scoop Jackson. It seemed to me that a paper like this had to be written because of the peculiar and some might even say slightly agonizing situation that the United States finds itself in as it heads towards the elections of 2024. Because for decades, I would argue, the United States has not really had a terribly serious approach to international affairs. It's a paradox. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, I would argue, no country in the world has ever been so powerful and so wealthy, had such great influence, such great reach as the USA. We, um, we put even the Romans and Genghis Khan in the shade when you consider the power and wealth and reach that the U.S. has. But paradoxically, since the end of the Cold War, we've really seen a period of prolonged subpar U.S. international leadership. And I'm not trying to be partisan about this at all. It's not particularly blue or particularly red. Uh, it's just what you might call the holiday from history flavor. Uh, More at some times than other times, perhaps, but enduring now for really a generation. And I argue in this paper that it's really not a contradiction at all. It is precisely this unusual moment in history that permitted Americans to be much less serious about the outside world than they would have needed to be in a time when American power was less overwhelming, less preponderant, in which dangers were a little bit more obvious. I think that maybe our holiday from history is coming to an end. I don't know if I would date it precisely to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but there are a number of wake-up calls that we can hear. Um, an international consortium alignment, call it what you will, um, legion of supervillains, whatever the right term is, seems to be developing between North Korea and Iran and Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. And whether we recognize it or not, they have very direct designs for the international order that the United States and her allies uh, strove to develop after World War II. They want to challenge it and they want to overturn it. So I I I used uh, I used the thinking of Senator Henry M. Scoop Jackson as a sort of a template to try to clarify or organize thinking about problems that the U.S. and the world are facing today. In part because Americans are not only good at learning lessons when they're presented to them, but they're very good about forgetting lessons. And there are very few people under the age of perhaps 50 nowadays in the United States who have ever heard of Scoop Jackson. And there are exceedingly few who remember what the Cold War was about, even. They certainly didn't know what it was like because they have no real living memory of it. Um, so Scoop Jackson was one of the towering figures of the Cold War, along with Ronald Reagan, along with some others that we could mention. George Shultz comes to mind. I know there are others we could also bring into this august grouping. But But Jackson's views, Scoop's views, I think provide a really helpful, clarifying approach for Americans and for others today. He realized, first of all and foremost, that the world is a dangerous place. And if you don't realize that the world is a dangerous place, dangerous things are, and very unpleasant things are likely to happen to you and to your friends and to vulnerable people in particular. He was a committed internationalist, which is to say, he recognized the value and the virtue of what we Americans might call Pax Americana, but what we can also call the liberal international order that was framed and fashioned not just by Americans, but with the help of many allies internationally, a framework for free trade and commerce and financial flows and investment, a security arrangement, a security architecture that included both NATO in Europe and a number of bilateral relations in Asia and some of the rest of the world, and that international cooperation of this sort was a tremendously effective means of promoting individual freedom and also individual prosperity, national prosperity as well. Um, and Scoop crucially, critically saw that uh, morality and power were indistinguishable. They were fused together in an American style approach to international relations and separated from each other only at great risk and peril. So from his very early years in the Senate, he was an advocate for human rights in the Soviet Union, the USSR being a system that made a principle of denying individual portions of human rights. They're only people's rights, but they could never be divided into individual portions. He was a staunch supporter of human rights and wished to see American power and principle conjoined and promoting well-being for not just the United States, but for others around the world. And in this paper, I tried to do the thought experiment. What would someone like Scoop Jackson think about the situation that the United States faces now? I never knew him. Elliott did know him. Elliott may have more detailed reflections upon this for that reason. But um, it seems to me that a Scoop Jackson style approach, for one thing, would recognize two of the flawed fancies that we continue to see in U.S. foreign policy about human rights. He had to deal with earlier variants of these. One was a so-called realist conceit. It's really quite self-crediting to call your viewpoint realist because it implies that everybody else is unrealist. I don't see why they didn't just call it smart and everybody else could be stupid. Um, but the descending from the Kissingerian approach that viewed moral moral considerations as dangerous and costly for statesmanship. Um, the idea then being to manage a Soviet competition rather than to defeat the Soviet Empire. Um, that has its modern analogs as well, and we see them today sometimes in discussions, even involving the war in Ukraine. Should the United States be involved at all, or should it save its powder for a more formidable foe in East Asia? The fear, of course, is if one avoids committing to an ongoing uh, aggression like Ukraine, the powder will be saved, never to be used. Um, the other side is on the other side of the extreme is a sort of uh, the solipsistic, endlessly self-critical, new left, uh, quote, human rights approach, which is really basically an argument about what is wrong with America. Uh, and not really terribly focused on other countries, but it's really looking at other countries through what we can see about ourselves. It's, you know, a little bit of a sort of a group session. We still see that was the trap that President Carter, who was not a new left person, kind of fell into in his application back in the 1970s, much to Scoop Jackson's dismay. We see that as well today in U.S. Foreign policy with this sort of self-referential solipsism, uh, maybe most horribly and perfectly encapsulated by raising the rainbow flag over the Kabul embassy in the doomed days immediately before the catastrophe of the failure there. Uh, so Scoop Jackson recognized that the greatest thing the United States could do for human rights in the world was to extend the power of freedom and, you know, U.S. and allied power, and I think that's still that still rings true. Uh, I I describe in my essay some of the ways that we might try to apply a Scoop Jacksonian approach to some of our current problems, um, a human rights-based approach towards North Korea, towards Iran, what could be done with Russian Federation. China is a China is also a challenge, a problem that a Scoop Jacksonian approach, I think, would merit application. And there's something quite new about the U.S. troubles with China that Scoop Jackson would not have seen, and I don't think would have. Elliott may correct me, but would not have had any immediate thoughts about, perhaps. Um, because of the bipartisan decision in the United States back in the early 1980s and later on to more or less chaperone the People's Republic of China into the world economy and into our structures of international governance. The uh, the Communist Party of China has leverage domestically, not just in the United States, but in the politics of all free and open societies, to create constituencies internally to advocate and militate for their goals that the Soviet Union never could have done because it was such a limited autarky. Um, I argue that we still don't even really have a language in the United States for dealing with this new problem, with this additional leverage that the CCP is able to utilize against open societies and against free governments. Uh, so sometimes we have to learn new lessons on our own, and we can't always look back to the masters and to the greats. But as a great, I argue that Scoop Jackson has a lot to teach us if we are willing to listen and to learn. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That was a masterful exposition of very kind of interesting topic that we will no doubt kind of delve into a little further. But it's interesting you left off on the China point, though, suggesting that that this is something fundamentally new. And of course, look, we have to obviously look at the approach from, say, 50 years ago, and how it obviously reflects the world today as much as the world of its time. So I think that's a sensible place to end off. But let me now bring in Elliott, because of course, Elliott, you had the policy making, if you like, experience of those days, and obviously the policy making experience since. So it'll be interesting to see, having lived it, as it were, with Scoop himself, how you feel those lessons have either, if you share Nick's view, they have been forgotten, and where we can go with them today.
Thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here today and to listen to Nick expound on his very interesting article. It's been a source of great pleasure to me that the Henry Jackson Society in London exists. We ought to have one in the US too. There isn't. There is a Henry Jackson Foundation in Seattle. Jackson was from Washington State, but it has become, I won't say woke, but certainly middle of the road on issues that Scoop felt really quite strongly about. So the real legacy institution, Alan, is you, the Henry Jackson Society. Let me try to follow up on Nick. Jackson was the child of Norwegian immigrants to the United States. And that actually had an impact on him. He used to say, look at Norway in the 1930s, one of the best countries in the world, fully democratic, early social insurance schemes, really a wonderful country to live in. And none of that helped at all when Hitler attacked. What helped and would have helped more was defense. It was military strength. And he learned that lesson, not only about small countries, but about the United States as well. He believed that it was critically important for the United States as the leader of the free world then, in opposition to the Soviet Union, to maintain a very high level of military strength, because he believed that to do otherwise was really to tempt the Soviets to act. So he was on the Senate Armed Services Committee and was an important bulwark of American military strength for decades. He was actually elected to the House of Representatives the same year, I believe it was 1948, as John F. Kennedy. And they shared that view of American military strength, and they were both, one can say, Cold Warriors. But, and Nick really did talk about this, but I would add some names. Jackson believed what Sakharov believed, not what Kissinger believed. By which I mean that Jackson thought that Kissinger's foreign policy was largely amoral. What Sakharov was saying was that the domestic arrangements in the Soviet Union had to be of great interest to every country in the world, because the Soviet Union was a superpower. Whether there was respect for law and human rights in the Soviet Union, Sakharov argued, was not some kind of luxury item that should be talked about in universities. It was essential to the nature of the Soviet system and to its foreign policy. So caring about freedom for Soviet citizens was important if you cared about freedom for your own citizens. Again, an argument that Nixon and Kissinger viewed as foolish, actually. But people like Sakharov and Sharansky did not view it that way. I mentioned Nixon and Kissinger, but one can equally mention Jimmy Carter. And this goes to Nick's theme of bipartisanship. I worked for Scoop in the Senate, and he put together a coalition of senators who cared a lot about military strength. And one thing that did not mark that coalition was party. It was Democrats and Republicans from various parts of the country who shared the view that we were in a very significant struggle morally against the USSR, and American strength was critical for freedom throughout the world. And nothing would be a greater guarantor of the defense of freedom and the spread of freedom than American military strength. I guess I'll leave it there, except to say one additional thing about Scoop, which was he was a very important person, which is why Nick was writing about him. He was, on the cover of Time magazine several times. He ran for president. He was a senator for decades. But boy, was he not a prima donna. He was a wonderful person to work for. And I worked for some people who had what I would view as correct views, but were more difficult to work for, others less difficult. Scoop Jackson was a wonderful person to work for, and always open to new ideas and new thinking, and concerned about ideas, holding Senate hearings about questions ranging from Soviet military strength to the organization of the United States government internally to deal with these foreign policy problems. Always with strong ties, though he was no intellectual himself, strong ties to the academic world, where he could try to find new ideas about international relations and about the US government. So it was a great experience to know him and work for him.
Well, thank you, Elliott. And sadly, never having known him, it's only through stories like this that you appreciate it, and of course through the academic work of people like Nick that actually brings it to life as well. I must so share actually one story. So we do get a lot of people who knew Senator Jackson, even though Nick's right, you have to be a certain age now to kind of get to that point. I remember Jay Johnson once came to speak to us in the House of Commons, and I was amazed to discover that he had a Scoop Jackson story himself. He said you don't understand what a gentleman he was. I was a young, kind of intern I think he was in the Senate at the time, and I don't know what possessed me, but I decided to take the special senator's elevator. And there's a senator's elevator that only the senators can use. And I'm mortified because as I, am going up, here comes, the door opens and Senator Jackson gets in. He looks at me, I look at him, and all he says to me is, "Good morning, Senator." And then we went on our separate ways, which just shows you that even, if you like, the least, sort of important person, as it were, from a prestige place, he was still keen to make you feel at home. But let's, kind of step away from, his sort of civil behavior in that sense, but look more at where we're going. And I think we do, of course, have an audience at home. So if you're watching and you want to ask a question, please do send something in and we will ask, but we will have a conversation ourselves first to lead on. Now, the things I've taken from both of you, what I think are important, is that number one, currently, we had a whole template in the Cold War for how we dealt with the challenge, if you like, to US and free world power, full stop. Essentially, we've been very good at forgetting those lessons because we had the so-called holiday from history. Nick, I'm not sure I'd agree with you that it ended in, as recently as 2022. I think, perhaps there are plenty of other, sort of warning signs in that sort of way. But clearly that's over. And what we appear to be lacking right now is that template, that sort of how are we going to handle this challenge, the challenge you, Nick, pointed out. This sort of growing alliance of bad actors in that sort of way. And I therefore wonder whether you can both distill, if you like, Jackson's view of how you maintain Pax Americana, stroke the sort of rules-based international order. If you could distill that and update it for the present day, how would both of you tackle that particular question? And if you were, going to advise the next president, whether that's Joe Biden or Donald Trump, what would you advise for them to do in that vein? And Nick, do you want to start, and then we'll go to Elliott?
Thank you, Alan. Yes, I take your point about earlier warnings that Holiday have hit. Crimea is a perfectly good one. Georgia might be another one. A full-scale invasion of a major European country, though, looks to me like a pretty good bookend for a holiday. But I do take your point. Part of the challenge, part of the problem is convincing people to have a little bit of courage and a little bit of confidence in the system that has brought such fantastic freedom and prosperity to the world. This isn't a scoop Jacksonian insight in particular. I go back to thinking about Joseph Schumpeter and Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, which he wrote back only a few years after World War II had ended. And at that point, Schumpeter, who I think had emigrated to the US and was a professor at Harvard, argued that the enrichment of societies has its own natural risks of creating an intelligentsia that despises the very engine that has brought them to the pinnacle of affluence and leisure and reflection. So there's there's a constant there's a constant effort that has to be made to explain to each rising generation why freedom is worth defending and why the rules-based international order is worth defending. And it's better to be able to make that case than to learn by sad experience of seeing things fall apart and have to repair them at great sacrifice and cost. Um, there's there's a lot that can be done to attend to the international economic order through trade arrangements, through investment arrangements in an open and free system. Some of that is rather technical, but the non-technical part is to appreciate that this creates an enormous number of winners all around the world. And it's not a coincidence that we are astonishingly close to ending global poverty, which is something that I never thought would be possible during my lifetime. Uh, India, according to the IMF, has now basically ended extreme poverty. I never thought this would happen in my lifetime. That's something that couldn't have happened at all without this international economic system that's worth defending. On the security side, part of what is necessary is not just United States interest in partners abroad. I think we could have more partners abroad than we have. I think we ought to be looking for recruits for rookies around the world who could be part of the system of helping to defend an international free order, and I think that they're out there. But also the diplomacy that will bring friends and allies to pull their part to avoid the free rider problem. The free rider problem is as pernicious in international security as it is in domestic welfare, and it creates it creates needless antagonisms and strains. So It is ironic that the best salesman for the US-led international security order turned out to be Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. I wish we had a little bit better salespersons at home, but the lessons are there to be learned.
Thank you, Nick. Elliott, your thoughts, updating the sort of approach, what would you say would be the dictums and where would you apply them?
First, I think we should say something about China. Jackson had a very warm relationship with the Chinese. And I think it needs to be understood in context. The context being there was an aggressive superpower in the Soviet Union. You think of the invasion of Afghanistan, for example, in 1979, the Sandinista Revolution, the Iranian Revolution. The very much weaker partner there was China. And it was his view that China could be a useful ally is not the right word, partner in a way against the Soviet Union for us, because the Chinese did worry a great deal about the Soviets. And one has to remember that this is at a moment, first of all, of the apex of Soviet power. It is also a moment after Mao's death of change in China. And when dealing with someone much more pragmatic, like Deng Xiaoping, it was possible not only for Jackson, but for many people to see there a China that was beginning to change, at least economically. Now, I think, Jackson, who died 42 years ago, would have a very different view of China, obviously, today, when it is by far the senior partner in the Chinese-Russian relationship and is now a very serious threat to the United States, which it was not in 40, 50 years ago. So I think his view of the international situation of China and its role in that situation would have changed. I think what absolutely would not have changed is his view that the sinews of power remain hard power, military power, which must be coupled with an ideological offensive on behalf of freedom. And as Nick was saying, one needs to explain to new generations here and elsewhere, what do you mean by that? What are you talking about? But it's just talk if you allow the United States Navy to diminish in size and the Air Force planes to become older than their pilots and the size of the Army to diminish. There's no question that, in my view, that were he here today, he would be leading the struggle again on Capitol Hill for the kind of significant increase in military power that he supported at the very end of the Carter administration after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and of course, came to fruition in the Reagan administration.
That's an interesting point, actually, just analysing, as you say, the differing, sort of periods in Jackson's career and how that can be related. I'm pleased you tackled the China point, though, because Gary Schmidt, who's watching, did, sort of bring up the China point and suggest that this might have been a blind spot. And, again, that's the contextualization, I think, of the situation at the time versus what we have today.
I don't think he had a blind spot on China, but he had a soft spot on China. Beyond the international situation, as I've just tried to describe it, his generation, his national security advisor was Dorothy Fosdick, daughter of the great Protestant minister Harry Emerson Fosdick. That generation had a kind of romance with China. These were people who had been, or whose fathers were, or whose brothers were missionaries in China. And I do think it's fair to say Scoop had a soft spot on China. I don't think it would have outlasted the change in China. But, going back to let's say the immediate aftermath of Mao, it was there.
Interesting. Yeah, and I suppose that's something, as you say, is a generational issue that we probably have less of today. Now, there's a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. I want to bring them in. So I've got a question firstly, and you can answer these both in any way you'd like. So John Soliday has asked, how should we maintain a free trade world and treat China's use of that system to undermine it? So it's essentially a twofold question. One, looking at sort of that policy, free world, how important is that? Oh, sorry, free trade, I should say. How important is that? And secondly, can we use the system against China? Secondly, Dan Hazelwood has basically pointed out again what you were saying, Nick, about, in the Cold War, we had, if you like, the human rights-centered approach of Carter, the realpolitik Kissinger approach, and then the path in between. And in fact, part of America's soft power was always, if you like, the moral weight, he says, of a more broadly defined human rights worldview, as opposed to human rights are everything in that sort of sense. So taking that to a point, his question essentially is not the current, if you like, centre-right critique of foreign policy that the human rights aspect is not important? Doesn't that ignore the soft power element? Basically, if you remove the soft power point of which human rights brings you, isn't that therefore a weakening of US ability to achieve its ends internationally, bring allies along and do other things? So you've got a few questions there. You can choose which of those to answer. Nick, let's get back to you for your thoughts.
Let's start with the question of China's accession into the WTO. At the time, it seemed as if it might be a reasonable gamble, at least it seemed to many on across the U.S. Political terrain, that it was a reasonable gamble to usher China in, to chaperone China into the WTO, under the arguments that, number one, this will lead to an enriching of the world, to export of deflation around the world, to lower poverty around the world, and also to make changes within China that would moderate or maybe even reform the political system there, and by this sort of nature bring Beijing into closer harmony or affinity with the US and the West. Well, the first part of that premise, I think, worked out very well. There's been China's entry into the global economy did lead to great prosperity in China and helped to export prosperity around the world. The rest of it turned out to be a terrible miscalculation. And just as in Bridge over the River Kwai, the Alex Guinnesses of our foreign policy establishment couldn't see what they were building there. And even today, some seem to be in denial and seem not to be able to recognize what so patently is obvious. One can be in favor of a free trade world and treat the CCP as a special case. And it is a very important, very subversive special case. And part of this is because, at least to my own reading of Chinese history, unlike the Soviet Union, China has thousands of years of more or less successfully marrying absolutism in the part of the imperial state with a fairly dynamic and flourishing market system. It may be a contradiction, but it's a contradiction that China has great memory plastic in being supple about. So probably the serious path at this point is to approach in a non-crash way, in a deliberate and sustained way, a sort of a decoupling and resourcing of arrangements that now are based in PRC. And some of this is already happening. Supply chains are moving elsewhere, the friendshoring, the reshoring. Heard all of those, catchphrases. But in more broadly, we don't even have the language yet for doing what I think needs to be done, which is to be able to look at transactions with a CCP-dominated Chinese economy and to do the sort of a net assessment. Is this good for the US and the West? Is this good for China? Is this a wash? We don't have the mental framework for that, and I don't know how long it'll be before we even develop the words for it. In the meanwhile, it's not a contradiction to have a strong global market system that doesn't have a subversive actor at the center of it. I'll stop with that. And there are many other
Noted.
questions.
Okay. Yes, Elliott, do you want to
on the
take that
second
on?
one, I have nothing to add to that except to nod my head. Soft power, I'm fully in agreement. We had this debate at the beginning of the Reagan administration because the president felt, President Reagan felt, and many of us felt, that this issue of human rights had been used badly by the Carter administration and had become a weapon against the free world, which was, perverse. But Reagan felt that it was an important part of American soft power to be on the side of freedom. You will remember, or depending on your age, you will have read, but in the 1960s, 70s, every Latin American country became, with a couple of exceptions, became a military dictatorship. And Reagan spent his 8 years in power slowly, gently escorting all of those generals out of power. Reagan escorted Ferdinand Marcos out of power. He took the lesson from Iran, from Nicaragua, that you don't want to make things worse. You don't want to follow a right-wing dictatorship with a left-wing dictatorship that would be even worse and linked to our enemies in the Soviet Union. But that was not a counsel of doom. He felt that with the moral pressure and the economic and military strength of the US, it was possible to use American hard and soft power to help the people of those countries transform them into democracies. And that is, in fact, what happened. It was a very successful policy. It culminated in the democratization of those countries. In a few cases, under George H.W. Bush, a year or two after Reagan left power, in many cases under Reagan, but he understood fully what he was doing. And he understood that being, let me reverse that. He understood that to call everyone who was anti-Soviet a friend and ally was a mistake, because we did not want to be indifferent. We could not be indifferent to their human rights abuses, because then you have no human rights policy at all. If you just say, well, we use human rights as a weapon against the Soviets and Cuba, but we give everyone a pass who's on our side, that's not a human rights policy. That's a cynical policy. And so I think it was done under Reagan. It is, and it is the policy that Jackson himself proposed with respect to the Soviet Union. It's hard to do because you don't want to replace a bad regime with an even worse regime. You don't want instability. You don't want to lead to anarchy and violence. So it's difficult, but when you have, what does it require? Statesmanship. I mean, it requires someone like Reagan and George Shultz, and it can then, I think, work pretty effectively.
Thank you. Very interesting overviews, both of you. Now, we've discussed, if you like, fallen empires like the Soviets and what may have replaced them. We've discussed, of course, countries like China, which were in a very different place at the time to where they are now. One country, of course, though, did emerge in its current form essentially during Jackson's tenure in the Senate. It was the latter part, of course. I'm talking about the Iranian Revolution in '79, and it was a problem then. It remains a problem now. I'm curious as to what you feel. I think, Nick, you've mentioned, of course, a human rights strategy towards Iran, and Elliott, you've obviously had extensive focus on Iran in your time. I'm wondering, firstly, what you felt Jackson himself thought of the revolution and what should have been done there, and crucially, bringing it up to date. Where do we take his approach in the current day, seeing as, frankly, the current approach is failing when it comes to containing Iran and understanding what we're going to do to stop it from being malevolent? So, in fact, Elliott, let's start with you this time. We'll go back to Nick on that basis.
Well, I won't try to put words in Jackson's mouth. What would he be thinking now, 40 years later? He certainly saw the overthrow of the Shah as a dangerous event. The Shah was a great American ally. He understood the human rights abuses. I would argue that he understood them a lot better than Jimmy Carter. You may recall where Carter spent the New Year's weekend of the end of his first year in power as president. Tehran, with the Shah, celebrating and making a speech about how your people love you, which was very far from the truth. Jackson would not make mistakes like that. And I think he was very disappointed that this revolution that really was the product of the Iranian people's desire then and now to live in a democratic republic was hijacked almost instantly by people who saw democracy as the enemy. I think it is fair to say that Jackson believed then that the United States needed to be the preeminent military power in the Persian Gulf and the Persian Gulf region. And I don't think it's a great stretch to say he would believe that now about the Mediterranean and about the Persian Gulf. The Iran that he knew in it was really the last years of his life, was one that was already very quickly saying death to America, death to Israel. And I think the policies that he would generally pursue would be dependent on a very strong American military presence in that region. In that, I think nothing has changed.
Noted. Nick, what's your thought? I mean, you've outlined a bit of a strategy, so what would you say?
What I suspect Henry Scoop Jackson could not have stomached is the continuing appeasement of the dictatorship in Tehran. I hope I'm not being terribly controversial about this. I think that there is an argument for appeasement in foreign policy under certain circumstances where a state is appeasable. And it has to be a specific, limited grievance that can be resolved without great cost and consequence. Where the disagreement is the existence of the state of Israel and the existence of the United States of America, little Satan and big Satan, negotiation's a little bit more difficult on something like that. What I notice, since I do demographics on the side, is that there are very interesting signals and hints that are coming out from Iran these days that may be relevant to the way that the United States and the free world should be should be treating the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's possible to be both totalitarian and corrupt at the same time. And the Iranian government is a poster child of existence proof of this. Uh, there is also, to a demographer, uh, serious, intriguing hints that the rank and file of the population may be completely out of sympathy with the dictatorship. What do I mean by this? At the moment, the birth level for the entire country of Iran is about the same as that of continental Europe, far below replacement, not what one would expect from a population that was sympathetic to the Islamist, the radical Islam nostrums. Tehran, the same birth level as Zurich. That doesn't look, that looks a little bit secular to me, you might say. Also, we read, at least in the international press, about the troubles that domestic clerics describe in Iran of lack of attendance and worship at the mosques. That something like 2/3 or maybe by now 3/4 of the mosques in the country have had to be closed because people aren't going there. That sounds to me like a pretty secular society. And if that is correct, there is much less sympathy for the dictatorship today than our current policies seem to suppose. And we might want to do a little bit more about it, and we want to say a little bit more to the people of Iran about that.
Well, yeah, I think that's quite important. This saying in support of people, I think that is key. Elliott, do you want to just come in on that?
Just to say that Scoop Jackson was a very strong supporter back in the days of the Cold War of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty,
yes,
Voice of America, all of the efforts to, now in those days we were talking about a brilliant new invention called the fax machine. The technology has changed, but I think Nick's point rightly suggests that fundamentally we're talking about two things. We're talking about ways of helping that population express itself, and we're talking about conveying our support for the population against the regime. We did that in the Soviet case. We have done it with remarkable unevenness in the Iranian case.
And what's particularly interesting about that point is, and I was having a discussion about this in the context of disinformation this week, whereas in the Cold War, we were very good at putting out the truth, if you like, to the Soviet bloc and beyond, and trying very hard to, kind of educate their people. Our capability, it would seem, have sort of atrophied in that. Whereas the other side, if we look at how Russia is trying to manipulate social media, and China owns a whole social media channel. I mean, could you imagine in the Cold War if the Soviets had put a TV channel, run from some Soviet subsidiary, claiming it was an independent country, beaming into your nation's kids? It would be absolutely extraordinary. Here we have TikTok, sort of free to do what it wants. I know there are moves in Congress, have been moves to change that, but it's quite extraordinary that on the, if you like, the information warfare side, the promotion of democracy, reaching people, we're quite good at it in the Cold War, and we've been pretty bad at it since. Is this an area you would both think we need to sort of focus on if we're truly to capture that Jacksonian spirit about the importance of human rights? Nick, do you want to start off, and then Elliott, and then I think we'll wrap up after that.
I mean, I'd make this as, I guess we're coming near our time. I'd make this as a sort of a final comment of mine. Fecklessness begins at home. May extend abroad, but it begins at home. And with relation to your comments about disinformation, Alan, we're having a terrible time in the U.S. With the question of the slow death of truth in the public square. And we see our colleges are wrestling with the question of whether there even is such a thing as truth in various departments. We've got a great problem with that in much of our media. And so it's not surprising that we see some of this reflected in our politics as well. That's an argument for getting our own home in order first. And in the same sense, fecklessness begins in public finances at home. The seeming inability to manage our own budget deficit in a time that we are regarding as one of untroubled international peace. If we can manage our own finances, we will also be able to manage international defense spending the way that we ought to, and we will be able to manage other things the way that we ought to. Same argument with the southern border crisis in the United States. That's not a problem that a serious country should be having. And it's a terrible example to our enemies, because it suggests all sorts of weaknesses and invites all sorts of advances in just regarding the United States as a place that doesn't even take its own security terribly seriously. It's a threat to other friends of ours.
And you make a very good point there, and we're having a similar debate about, and we're an island, don't forget, so we're having a similar point about stopping the boats. We can't even do that. So it's fascinating how this plays in. Elliott, you get the last word quickly on
very quickly, I'd say I'm just repeating what we've said here, but unfortunately, there is a kind of bifurcation in the US and many other countries between people who think they should be supporting human rights, democracy, principle in foreign policy, and people who believe in a strong defense, strong military power. And perhaps no lesson of the life of Henry M. Jackson is more important than his view that the two must go together and reinforce each other to have their most beneficial impact on our own freedom and security.
Brilliantly summed up. Thank you, Elliott, for your insights and for ending on that rather positive note, that way we could go. Nick, of course, thank you for the original manuscript and for adding colour to it. Today, I think we've all come away with a sense of, figures from the past, in particular, dear old Scoop Jackson, have an enduring value to strategic thinking and moral thinking today. That clarity, I hope, can carry through, both in our politics and in your politics. So I want to thank you both, of course, and I want to thank all of those who joined us for this discussion today. And I'm sure we'll have more to say on the subject in the future. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, yes.
All right, we're off air.
Okay.